The Steelers have a few important matters to resolve before the season starts, and man, Omar Khan is going to have his hands full behind the scenes. But I'll save that topic for another time. Right now, I want to talk about something else that could change everything for the Steelers in 2027. I'll give you all the details in a moment. But before we go on, make sure you've subscribed to the channel. Only do it, though, if you've been a Steelers fan for over 10 years. Hit the like button if you believe we'll make it to Super Bowl 61. And if you can, write this: Go Steelers! We're stronger than the Ravens. Man, I really believe that. Now, let's get down to business. It all starts with a major change to the NFL calendar that could drastically affect how the Steelers approach one of their most critical decisions in the coming years: finding the next quarterback to be the face of the franchise. According to available information, the NFL has announced changes to the 2027 off-season schedule. The NFL Combine is set to wrap up on March 8th, with the legal tampering period expected to begin immediately afterward, on March 9th. That might seem like a simple scheduling tweak, but when you consider everything front offices have to do during that window, it becomes a massive shift. In previous years, teams had a longer gap between the Combine and the start of free agency. That extra time allowed organizations to finish evaluating promising quarterbacks, compare those evaluations against veteran options on the market, discuss every possible scenario, and ultimately make well-informed decisions. Now, that luxury may be gone. For the Steelers, this means preparation becomes even more important. Instead of spending additional days reviewing film, comparing notes, and debating every possible option after the Combine, they may need to arrive in Indianapolis already knowing exactly what direction they want to take. Think about how significant that really is. The Combine has always been one of the busiest weeks of the NFL offseason. Coaches, scouts, general managers, agents, and executives are all gathered in one place. Conversations happen everywhere. Rumors begin circulating. Trade possibilities start taking shape. Teams gather information constantly. Now imagine having to make franchise-changing decisions almost immediately after leaving that environment. That's exactly why this new calendar could completely change the Steelers' approach. One interesting point raised in the discussion is that veteran quarterbacks who become available in free agency may disappear much faster than before. If players like Baker Mayfield or Kyler Murray were ever among the top veteran options available during that offseason, Pittsburgh wouldn't have the luxury of waiting for weeks before making a decision. The market could move almost immediately once legal tampering begins. That creates pressure, real pressure. Instead of reacting slowly, teams would have to enter the Combine with their plans almost finalized. Another important topic mentioned is how this affects quarterbacks, who typically take more time before making career decisions. The discussion references Aaron Rodgers and notes that situations where a quarterback waits before choosing his next destination could become much more difficult under a faster off-season schedule because teams may no longer be able to wait, while free agency moves quickly around them. For Pittsburgh, that could push the organization toward making earlier commitments. Rather than sitting back and seeing how everything develops, they may need to choose one path before the market even opens. Do they trust the draft, or do they pursue a veteran? Waiting might no longer be an option. One of the most interesting ideas discussed is that the Steelers could arrive at the NFL Combine already knowing whether they intend to draft a quarterback. Instead of using the event to help make that decision afterward, the organization may need to have already reached its conclusion before the workouts even begin. That changes the purpose of the Combine itself. Instead of asking, "Should we draft a quarterback?" the Steelers might already know the answer. The Combine would simply confirm whether their preferred targets deserve that level of confidence. The conversation also points out that every NFL organization could face similar pressure. Decisions that previously unfolded over several weeks might now happen within days. That means mistakes become more likely, aggressive moves become more common, and competition for quarterbacks could become even more intense. And that's where things become really fascinating. If the Steelers decide before free agency that the draft is their preferred path, they may ignore veteran options altogether and place all of their focus on selecting their future quarterback. That doesn't necessarily guarantee they'll move aggressively. In fact, another opinion shared is that Pittsburgh would probably remain cautious instead of panicking, even if draft trade prices increase because of the compressed timeline. The belief expressed is that the Steelers would trust the scouting work they've already completed, rather than overreact to outside pressure. That sounds very much like the Steelers' philosophy we've seen for years: preparation, patience, discipline. Still, even disciplined organizations can find themselves in difficult situations. One scenario discussed involves Pittsburgh deciding that the draft is the clear answer, only to discover on draft night that multiple quarterbacks they value are expected to disappear before their current draft position. If that happens, the Steelers could be forced to consider moving up earlier than originally planned in order to secure their preferred player. Not because they suddenly became reckless, because circumstances left them with very few alternatives. That's an important distinction. The pressure created by the new off-season calendar doesn't automatically force bad decisions. It simply reduces the amount of time available to make them. Another interesting observation is how the NFL Combine itself becomes even more valuable. The discussion emphasizes that Indianapolis has long been the place where rumors begin because everyone involved in the league is gathered together having conversations throughout the week. Under the revised schedule, those discussions become even more meaningful because free agency follows almost immediately afterward. Instead of rumors slowly developing over several weeks, decisions could accelerate almost overnight. For Steelers fans, that means future off-seasons may feel dramatically different. News could arrive faster. Trades could develop quicker. Quarterback markets could change within hours instead of days. Everything becomes more intense. Everything becomes more unpredictable. And whenever quarterback decisions become unpredictable, every fan base pays attention. The discussion repeatedly comes back to one central point: preparation will matter more than ever. The Steelers won't simply be reacting to what happens around the league. They'll need to anticipate it. Their evaluations will have to be completed earlier. Their priorities will need to be clearly established. Their contingency plans must already exist before the combine begins. That's a significant organizational challenge. But it's also an opportunity. Teams that prepare better could gain an enormous advantage. Those that hesitate may watch their preferred options disappear almost immediately. Whether Pittsburgh ultimately chooses a veteran quarterback, focuses entirely on the draft, or adjusts depending on how the market unfolds, one thing seems increasingly clear based on this discussion: the margin for error is shrinking. Every conversation, every scouting report, every interview, every evaluation, each one becomes even more important when there is less time available to reconsider. That's why this seemingly simple NFL scheduling change could eventually become one of the most influential developments affecting the Steelers' search for their next franchise quarterback. Maybe the average fan won't think much about a calendar adjustment today, but front offices certainly will, because championships are often shaped by preparation long before draft night ever arrives. And if this new timeline creates more chaos across the NFL, the Steelers will have one goal above everything else: making sure they're one of the organizations that enters the storm with a clear plan instead of searching for answers at the last minute. Now, let's talk about this. One thing that always happens before training camp is that people start comparing rosters on paper. Every analyst releases rankings, every website has its own predictions, and suddenly everyone is convinced they already know which teams are ready to dominate the AFC North. Personally, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes fans can make this time of year. The Steelers don't have to prove they're the deepest team in football before a single snap is played. What they have to prove is that they can put their best players in positions to succeed when the games actually begin. That's a completely different conversation. Every offseason, depth charts become one of the biggest talking points around the NFL. Some teams are praised because they seem to have quality backups everywhere, while others are criticized for depending too much on their stars. But once the regular season starts, those preseason rankings rarely tell the whole story. For Pittsburgh, the biggest question isn't whether every position has the strongest backup in the league. The real question is whether the players expected to lead this team can perform at the level everyone believes they're capable of. That's why I keep looking at this roster differently. When you have veterans who understand what it takes to compete, experienced leaders in the locker room, and a defense that already has proven playmakers, the conversation changes. Suddenly, it becomes less about having the perfect roster from top to bottom, and more about getting the most out of the players who will spend the most time on the field. Training camp is where those answers begin. This is when coaches discover combinations that nobody expected. Young players force themselves into bigger roles. Veterans show they still have plenty left in the tank. Sometimes a player who barely receives attention in July becomes one of the biggest surprises by October. That happens every single year. It's also why I never put too much weight into off-season rankings. Football isn't played on spreadsheets. It's played every Sunday by players who continue developing throughout the season. Another thing that makes this upcoming camp so interesting is the number of unanswered questions that still exist. Several positions have competition that feels completely open, and that's actually a healthy situation for a football team. Competition creates urgency. Players understand that nothing will be handed to them. Every practice matters. Every preseason snap matters. Every opportunity becomes important. And when that happens, coaches usually get the best version of everyone involved. I also believe one area fans should watch closely is the defense. Not because it's expected to struggle, but because there are several players who could end up being used in different ways than people initially expect. Modern NFL defenses demand versatility. It's no longer enough to simply line up in the same position every snap. Defenders are asked to blitz, cover, stop the run, disguise coverages, and move around depending on the opponent. Coaches love players who can wear multiple hats, because that flexibility makes an entire defense harder to predict. Sometimes the biggest improvement doesn't come from adding another star. Sometimes it comes from finding the perfect role for someone already on the roster. We've seen that happen across the league many times. A player who looked average in one role suddenly becomes extremely productive after being moved into a system that better matches his strengths. That's exactly why training camp is so valuable. Experimentation happens. Coaches test different packages. Players learn new responsibilities. Some ideas work immediately. Others disappear after only a few practices. But every experiment helps shape what the final roster looks like. Offensively, the biggest objective remains consistency. A talented offense means very little if it can't sustain drives, protect the football, and finish possessions. Those are the small details that separate playoff teams from everyone else. That's why the coaching staff will likely spend just as much time focusing on execution as they do on play design. Fans often get excited about highlight plays during camp. The coaches usually care much more about routine plays being executed correctly. Can the offense stay ahead of the chains? Can the protection communicate effectively? Can receivers consistently create timing with the quarterback? Can the running game produce manageable third downs? Those details determine how successful an offense becomes over a 17-game season. Defensively, the objective is just as simple. Create pressure, force mistakes, win the turnover battle. When the Steelers' defense has played its best football over the years, it hasn't always required perfection. It has relied on creating momentum-changing plays that swing games at the biggest moments. That's the identity fans want to see again. As camp gets closer, expectations naturally continue growing. That's what happens every summer. Optimism starts building. Every practice is analyzed. Every roster move becomes a headline. Every impressive performance creates excitement. But patience is still important. Training camp isn't about winning championships. It's about laying the foundation for the months ahead. The teams that stay healthy, continue improving, and develop chemistry usually find themselves playing meaningful football when winter arrives. And that's exactly where Pittsburgh wants to be. Instead of worrying about where outside analysts rank this roster today, the focus should remain on what this group becomes once they finally take the field together. Because history has shown that the NFL rarely unfolds exactly the way preseason predictions suggest. And sometimes, the teams that receive the most questions during the summer end up answering all of them once the games actually begin. Now, I want to hear from you, Steelers Nation. Do you think this new off-season schedule actually gives the Steelers an advantage because they'll prepare earlier? Or do you believe it creates even more pressure when searching for the team's next franchise quarterback? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more Pittsburgh Steelers coverage, and, as always, go Steelers! Road to the Super Bowl!